Hey folks, today we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about top-down processing. So here's what I want you to keep in mind while we're looking at the slides here today in this lecture. First, what is top-down processing exactly and what does it do? Why do we even have this term and why do we have any interest in this concept? How does this process work? How is it initiated? And finally, what kinds of processes are considered to be top-down processes versus maybe a bottom-up process or some other process. So if we take a look at this slide with the word search puzzle here, we've all seen something like this on the internet where someone might post this and say something like, the first three words determine something about your personality. I would say wrong. What they're asking you to do is to engage in a bottom-up process of just spending your time looking for words that may or may not be easy to locate, and you may not really know what you're looking for. So the search might begin at the top, the bottom, or you might be looking for words that are easily spelled out versus words that are diagonal or backwards. This approach can take a little longer because there's no specific direction. And so we're just kind of like randomly using different strategies and perhaps eventually finding some words depending on how difficult the word puzzle is. Now, if we are going to take a top-down approach, what would be happening is we'd be given a specific instruction like to find the word whiskers, and then we might think we can start out by looking for the letter W first, and then this reduces our time significantly because there are only a few W's in the entire puzzle. So then finding the word whiskers is relatively easy to do. Obviously, this top-down approach is much more efficient, takes a lot less time, and involves a strategy. If we know what word we're looking for, this makes things easier than looking for words that we're not sure if they even exist in the puzzle or not. So now take a look at this image without reading any of the text. Take a look at this and see if you can find something without being told what to look for. You might have seen something like this in a psych textbook somewhere. And when we look at this image without a reference for what to do with it, we might be looking at the white spaces, the black spots, or maybe just sections of it. And it will still take more time to figure out exactly what is in the image that we're supposed to be seeing. Again, this is a purely bottom-up approach, and what your brain is scanning is its memory for all possible objects that could potentially fit with this image. And maybe your mind will find it and maybe it won't. But if we're given a specific instruction of looking for a dog, the time it takes to find the dog is much shorter because then our mind is looking for something that conforms to what we can reasonably recognize as a dog. So if you haven't already found it, what you're looking for here is a Dalmatian. In the middle of the picture here, he's sort of facing away from you and looking down towards the ground. So once you see that Dalmatian image, it gets hard to unsee it after that. So again, the top-down process basically constrains our mind to look for specific information, whereas in bottom-up, we're looking way more broadly and using a lot more mental energy to try and figure it out. For what it's worth, I even had trouble looking at that Dalmatian photo at first. When I first saw it, I had no idea what I was looking at. And then when I read the directions that there's a Dalmatian there, I instantly found it. So if you had the same experience, don't feel bad. Okay, so this graphic here that you're going to see in the textbook refers to the Bayesian method for information processing. And I know this seems a little bit weird talking about a top-down influence when the graphic seems upside down, but bear with me. If you start at the bottom with the entry of some stimulus to your senses, then generating some ideas about what the stimulus is, then incorporating some background knowledge and the Bayes rule, which is to say how probable or likely something is as far as we understand it, then ultimately arriving at a decision about what that thing is. So just the upward trend in the process does refer to the bottom-up process that we've been talking about from the previous slides, but what is happening in the midst of this is that our mind is already making judgments about what we're perceiving based on our background knowledge and experience. And also, our mind is weighing the probability of something occurring in reality before we've even really had a chance to fully process it. And we'll talk more about this in the later slides. Then our sensory information is affected because once our mind makes a decision about it, it gets to be difficult to undo it. For example, if you go back now and look at the Dalmatian slide in the previous example, try to unsee that Dalmatian now. It's hard and it's automatic now to some degree. So there are some real benefits to this top-down processing. If you think about it, this process is much faster and much more efficient at making snap judgments on a more or less continuous basis, and is really good at filtering out extraneous information that we might not really need to make those judgments. So biologically, our brain is going to take less energy and actually has less neurons firing and communicating with each other when they're engaged in this top-down process. So one thing I think you guys should really be focusing on here and asking yourselves is, yeah, but what about the costs of this process? Are there any downsides to this? If any of you have taken a social psychology course already, you should already know the answer to this in terms of making judgments. All right, I hate this graphic because it is really messy and confusing, but we're going to take a look at it anyway. One of the things you want to think about is the fact that when we are processing higher level information, like analyzing our dog's behavior or making choices between whether you want a taco or some pizza, these are processes that happen outside of the stimulus usually and are generated inside the processing stream itself. So try not to get too caught up in the complexity of this graphic, but one of the things you should take away from this is that in a very short period of time, we're talking about milliseconds if you look at the y-axis there. The visual cortex is communicating with itself in different regions, and in the inferior temporal cortex, which is at the box at the very top there, that's where object recognition occurs, but also gives feedback back downward to the visual cortex, and this information is recirculated across these different areas. In case you're wondering what the LGN is, it's the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is a specific section of the thalamus that processes and directs visual information. And MT refers to the medial temporal area, which also serves to act as sort of like visual memory. The linear paths in this information processing model is shown by the blue arrows. And what we are measuring on the y-axis again here is the latency, or how many milliseconds does it take for a typical brain to do this. So again, another takeaway you should be getting from this graphic is that this whole process is circular, and that the top-down process is actually, at least it appears to be, hardwired into the brain. Otherwise, there wouldn't be all these directions and circular pathways occurring that are actually kind of like feedback loops. So in other words, our brain area seems pre-wired to make judgments on perceptual information based on experience. But why do you think this would be the case? And what purpose would it serve? Well, one interesting piece of research from a researcher named Barr was to investigate at what point is there enough information being generated in this loop to be able to go ahead and make a decision or judgment about sensory information. And basically what they found is that roughly halfway through this process, the mind is already making a blueprint or some type of rough draft, I guess you could say, of the information to make at least an initial thought. Then, using more experience and context, this blueprint or rough draft is fleshed out. Of course, the mind isn't going to wait for all the information before it starts to try and form ideas about that information. Again, I would ask you guys to think, well, why is the brain doing this? Why is it operating on only partial information? What purpose does this serve? Okay, another takeaway you should be getting from this lecture is that the terms top-down and bottom-up information processing are really relative terms. It isn't always the case that we'll be looking at a photo like the Dalmatian and being asked to look for a dog. Perhaps you might be given more vague instructions, and the mind will have to work a little harder to try and identify some alternatives for what is being seen or perceived. The core idea here is that the mind will probably always do the easiest and quickest way possible, even though sometimes that might lead us to some incorrect conclusions. Also, it's worth talking about this idea of Gestalt in this discussion. This is a concept that you should have read about either in intro psychology or maybe in developmental psychology if you've had that course. So what this is our minds at least appear to be pre-wired to have certain abilities to detect certain visual properties like proximity and similarity, for example. It used to be believed that the reason that the brain would have these built-in qualities is that the mind would be evolved and adapted over time in a way that reflects real-world scenes and objects. And if you subscribe to that idea, this would suggest that if we study younger and younger people, we would always see these abilities if we believe that there are truly any kind of bottom-up processes at all, and at least any ones that would matter. So if you think about it, we would see certain things, even in infants, that would appear to be hardwired abilities to process certain types of sensory information. But there are some studies that seem to suggest that even at very young ages, like even 3-month-olds, these infants are developing experiences that can feed into the subconscious process of making judgments about sensory information. So this idea that I talked about before of, your mind making decisions and doing things that you're not even aware of, that's not just something that happens during adulthood. This happens over your entire life, including before you were even aware that you had an awareness. So how far back does this even go? Do we get experiences at subconscious level at birth, maybe even before that? I'm not sure that we can realistically arrive at an answer to this question because of all kinds of obvious limitations, like how are you going to ask an infant a question and get an answer? You're not. And obviously, we're going to run into a lot of problems trying to study babies' minds before they're even born, right? So as you can see, there are always going to be unanswered questions here, and unfortunately, some real obvious limitations in getting these answers. And I'm sorry to have confused you or bored you with this information, but this is really useful stuff to think about and contemplate as a bigger worldview of sensation and perception. And with that, have a great week.